Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I know a few of you are still logging in, but we'll go ahead and try to stay on schedule here. My name is Sean O'Brien, president of QwickRate, and I'm as always, pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve's director of analytics here at QwickAnalytics. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks everybody for spending some time with us this morning. So I've been working with Sean and QwickRate for I guess a little over a decade now, but my background is in working with community banks all around the country in all aspects of strategic planning and valuation to M&A and capital advisory and model design and maintenance. My whole career has been kind of about an inch wide and a mile deep as it pertains to community banks.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Again, reminder, I think everybody's pretty familiar with how our format works. Certainly hit the Q&A button or the chat feature. We'll be monitoring those through the coffee talk and then taking those as they come through, as they arise when there's an appropriate break in the conversation. Again, I think we have found these to be in a hopefully an effective way for all of us to kind of share thoughts and questions. We are kind of transitioning now to the point where we actually are going to start implementing. So I'm sure our focus with these throughout the first quarter and the rest of the year will evolve. But again, trying to provide a resource to share not only questions that all of you might be having, but then again try to share better tips on how to use the tool, enhancements we're making, and suggestions that might make the transition more easy. Okay, so there has been, and I think will continue to be, a number of enhancements and updates that we make to the tool. Many of them are directly through conversations with you, our users. This is a listing of them. We're going to talk about a few of these as we move forward. But Steve, here, anything you want to go into before we go into any of the specific slides?
No, a lot of these, some of you who are familiar with the tool have probably seen some of these in action already. And as Sean said, there's a handful more that we're certainly going to be working on this year, and we might bump into a couple of those in our conversation today. But as far as this list is concerned, I'll give you a brief demo of how the data file upload storage management tool works. We can talk a little bit about policy templates, and we'll do a little bit more work today also kind of walking through that complete the historical data set. We got a lot of feedback from our users now that everyone's kind of digging into the details and the nitty-gritty of the day one transition calculations, and then getting comfortable with those lifetime historical loss rates and doing some additional auditing there to get comfortable with how those calculations are done. We'll give you kind of a real world example of how that how you can work with the sort of the data dump, so to speak, that historical Excel data set that gives you all the data you would need in order to do a full audit of any one of the historical or lifetime loss rates that we have in the tool. If your auditors or examiners are poking at you for more more detailed calculations.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I know a lot of you have asked about that. And so again, I think Steve has already put some work here, but I think our team will try to do what we can to make that process as manageable for you as we can. So certainly a number of topics this month as we kind of work through day one. I think as Paul Allen mentioned in last month's presentation, and we'll kind of re-speak, is the idea that you want to close out 12/31 using your incurred loss, and then obviously run a parallel comparison. Steve, anything you want to go ahead and take on these slides?
No, I think the major takeaway is that while CECL is effective as of January 1st, nothing magical happens on January 1st. Hopefully none of us were even in the office on January 1st looking at this, but the basic concept is, January is for dealing with December, right? Closing out last year. And again, last year, unless you're one of the very, very few, last year was your standard ALLL calculation with absolutely no adjustments or mention of CECL whatsoever. So once you're done with 12/31 and you have your regular ALLL calculations, Then, whether it's now, whether it's sometime next month, is when you start really looking at doing that calculation as of that same date for CECL, for an ACL calculation as of that date, comparing the two, getting comfortable with whatever that difference is, right? Your day one surplus or shortfall, and then getting your accounting entries set up for that day one, which is all happening on the balance sheet. There is absolutely no income statement adjustment done on day one. Really, the income statement works and will work exactly as it has in the past, right? You have charge-offs and recoveries going directly in or out of your balance sheet, and you increase your reserve by having provisions on the income statement, just like you have in the past. So really, the only significant difference in accounting from an entry standpoint is what we do that one-time thing that's as of January 1st, but not done on January 1st. You can really do it. We see people doing it anytime throughout the first quarter and simply backdating that to be effective as of January 1st. Sean?
Yeah, I think as Steve mentioned, right? Run the incurred loss model, run the parallel as of 12/31 using the CECL tool, identify if there is a difference that needs to be booked. And then again, when we hit the first quarter, we'll be using the ACL or CECL calculation going forward, but then that process will be all very, very similar. So the second thing I think we've heard a lot of questions around is policies. I think again last month we touched on just some of the ideas with the policy. It's important. Again, I think Paul made the point that and I think I agree, right, is probably less is more a lot of times. This can sometimes be an easy give to your regulators or auditors if they want additional, but his point is that you don't have to restate the guidance. We have developed a couple of templates to assist you. I don't believe they're on the site. You can certainly email us them for them if you'd like. Again, we because of the number of requests that we had from our users around a policy, we decided we would, venture into this. It's not typically something we would do, but given the number of users that we have and the number of users who requested it, we did put together a couple of templates. They're not dramatically different. A lot of it's really just kind of on your preference or style of how you like your policies to be written. We do think we cover all of the key components, which really do involve identifying the people responsible for handling the tool, the frequency that you'll review it, assumptions around how you're going to use maybe a tool such as ours to help you. And again, I think we hit the high points. You can certainly personalize it and customize it as you see fit. Steve, anything you want to add here?
Nope. You can thank Sean for that. He really spearheaded that effort to get some policy statement stuff in there. That's a little bit outside my area of expertise. So that was all you, Sean.
Oh, well, thank you, Steve. And thanks, Celeste, for the kind words about the policy. Yeah, like I said, it took a little bit longer than we had hoped. Again, we really did try to run the gamut of trying to be brief and we will send a copy of the slides, Barry. Yes, thank you. We will send out, I forgot to send that at the top. We'll send a copy of the slides and a link to the recording today upon conclusion of this, the webinar. But again, back to the policy, we did really try to, take a thoughtful approach, not to be too verbose, but also make sure we hit what we felt like were the key components necessary. Again, just a reminder, I think the fundamental difference as we get into this in between CECL and the old incurred loss model is really about, the change from an annual loss environment to a more aggregated multi-year charge-off experience, right? Really, that's what FASB was after, was really a more conservative life or economic cycle approach to net charge-offs. It is inherently more conservative. But I think, again, trying to remember what we're tasked to do, we're trying to establish a reserve necessary to cover losses. Now we're just essentially doing that in a different way. Steve, anything you'd like to jump in on this?
No, I mean, that's the general concept there. I think we're about to dig into it in a little bit more detail. So let's just we'll go ahead and do that. On the next
Yeah,
slide. Oh, go ahead.
Yep, and I was just gonna say, David, we will send out a policy to you later today.
Yep.
Okay, all right, so here, again, another common question, and Steve's gonna handle this. We have gotten a number of requests just to better understand how we actually calculate our numbers. Because if you remember in our tool, we show you annual numbers, but underneath those are 4 quarterly quarters worth of data. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of walk through, in fact, how we calculate our numbers, but also remind you this is in the resources section
Yep.
of the CECL solver.
Well, I'm going to walk. Can you, if you can unshare your screen so
Yep.
I can share mine, and we'll kind of walk it through here. Let's see, share screen, and we'll go with that one. Right. Let me know when you can see that.
I can see it, Steve.
Excellent. So this is this is the same sample institution that we use on all of our webinars. And let's just say for now we were looking at a 2-year warm and a 2-year look back period. If I go into the historical detail, or let me back up for 1 second. Let's pick our guinea pig for today. Let's say 1 to 4 family junior liens over a 2-year look back period and a 2-year warm. The bank had a 1.23% historical lifetime loss rate. So a lot of math goes into that number, right? Most of the details of that math are right here on the historical analysis tab. This is where we look at those balances over time. We track the balances by call report segment. And then down here, we also track charge-offs, recoveries, net charge-offs, and then finally the net charge-off ratio. And you can see here that lifetime loss rate, 2-year aggregate loss rate of 1.23%, like we saw in the summary. The next step is a lot of our users say, well, I need to be able to see every number that goes into that 1.23%. I need to audit it completely 100%. And I can't do it from what you see here from what I see on the screen. That's correct. So we made the decision a long time ago to, when we're presenting this data, present annual columns so you could see long-term trends on the screen. We certainly could have made the choice to show every single quarterly column all the way back 15 years, but then obviously it would be pretty unwieldy page, right? You wouldn't be able to print it off or anything else because you'd be scrolling back and forth for 60 columns. So the idea was we present annualized data here and you can see those trends. And if people need to do a full audit, then we can send them the data. So this is that step that we took to be able to provide that. So the next step would be to show all of the quarterly data points that go in here and then show that calculation, which is what we'll go ahead and do now. So if I want the complete historical data set, right? Every quarterly data point for charge-offs, recoveries, and everything. When I go to export, I can go to detailed historical data set right here. And if I click on that, I took the liberty of downloading it a few minutes ago. This, of course, it's on the other screen. This is what that looks like. So this has your loan balances for every single quarter going all the way back 15 years, plus or minus. And then here are our gross charge-offs, gross recoveries, net charge-offs, and finally net charge-off ratio. So with this data, I can do that calculation. Now let me go here. This is on our resources. Again, on the CECLSolver resources button right here, you can download this. This Excel file just shows it's the historical loss rate calculation example. So here are those quarterly charge-offs, recoveries, net charge-offs, and loan balances. And how we calculate, let's say we were looking for a 3-year calculation. We're going to aggregate 3 years worth of net charge-offs. So these are all the quarterly net charge-off values for 3 years or 12 quarters. We add them up to get a total of, let's say, 6.2 million. That's our numerator. And our denominator is the average loan balance over that same 3 years. Now, when you're doing an average balance for a balance sheet item like loans, you always need to use one more period, right? So for 3 years, you're actually going to use not 12 quarters, but 13 quarters to get of your period end loan balances. Average out all those guys, and that's your average balance over the entire look back period. And then the lifetime net loss rate just becomes this divided by that. So you might recognize this type of math. This is how you calculate a typical net charge-off ratio. This is simply a multi-year aggregate net charge-off ratio, right? Numerator is net charge-off, denominator is average loan balance.
Yeah, and Steve, I think I re-emphasize just how we do calculate that average balance. So I think that is a common misunderstanding too, as well.
Yeah. So if you're calculating, if you're doing an average loans over a quarter, right? You take just for a single quarter, it's a 2-point average, right? You have a beginning, end of the previous period, end of this period. So a 2-point average for one quarter. For 12 quarters or 3 years, you're going to have a 13-point average, right? Because you're taking the period end balance from right at the beginning of that period all the way till now. So for a 3 years of net charge-off, that's 12 quarters. 3-year average of loans, that's 13-point average because you're taking the balance again at the beginning of it.
And I think that's a common source of confusion that I think a lot of you have when you're actually trying to replicate our numbers, and that's why I wanted Steve to go through that.
So if I was doing this for Camden, I would come in here and let's say I was choosing the first lien. I would take my net charge off and I would literally scrolling all the way. It's a lot of data. I'd highlight these values. Highlight those values, just hit Control C, copy them, and then paste them right over to here. And then I would do the same thing for the period end balances and I would paste them here. And then you would end up having an exact replica of all the data that goes into our lifetime loss rate calculation.
Yeah, that's great.
And that would be, so again, we're using all these same, you'll notice each of the period end and year end values from here will match in the Excel file. We're just giving you all the quarters in between so that you can do a perfect calculation of this 1.23% or any other of them. And then if you want to change, if you change your WARMs, obviously you have all the data you need no matter what length of the look back period, what WARM you want to use in order to audit all that. So I know we've kind of gone over this in the past some, but it's a frequent question and we really want you to understand that in detail because it's critical for, it's one of the biggest assumptions, not assumptions, one of the biggest inputs into your calculations are going to be, what is that lifetime? What is that historical lifetime, right? What is the WARM? And then what is the loss rate over that period? And I'm sure we'll continue to get questions about it, but we have all the resources there now that you can navigate it and give that to your auditors if they're breathing down your neck about it.
Yeah, and I would say that really was kind of the impetus for it, right? So we have our SOC where we have had a third party validate, the steps that Steve just did with our tool. However, there is an aspect of the validation that many auditors might ask you individually at the bank to say, we want you to replicate your numbers, and that export will allow you to do that. So,
and all you'd have to do if you did that and you were validating and replicating the entire thing and you want it, and they also wanted a spot check, you can just go directly to your call report, print off just one call report from any random period, and those loan values and those charge-off values will perfectly match what you have in there. So that could take you, full circle, right? From your call report to our Excel-based tool, to the interactive tool, to the lifetime loss rate calculations, if they're requiring that you tie up every single step there. But we go through every step of that as part of the SOC report. They validated pretty much all the controls and calculations around everything that we just went through.
And Steve, if you wouldn't mind just clicking on the resources button again, just to show everybody again where these are. So a couple of questions have come in. First was, how do you decide what the look back period should be, 3, 5, 10 years? Again, that'll be based on your WARMs, right? So you're going to calculate those, and then it's a symmetrical look back based on that remaining maturity. Yeah,
we've seen a lot of different methodologies take different look at what a look back should be. The look back period is certainly very subjective. It is an assumption and it is subjective, and there is no right or wrong answer for it. However, typically what we see in a lot of other tools or other ones that we've been able to look at over the years is that they're relatively arbitrary. They choose a 3 or a 5 year look back period across the board for every segment of the portfolio, just because they don't have any better ideas, so to speak. And so we think is a more advanced approach to it, that since CECL is about losses over the remaining lives of the assets, we're trying to get a feel for how these assets perform over their lifetime. We think there should be some symmetry between what the average duration of that loan segment is, right? How long the loans in this bucket live for, and how far back in history we're looking as a look back period. So we match the look back period to the WARM. So for mortgage loans, we're looking further back in history because we want to see how they perform over a longer period. Whereas construction loans, if you're looking back 10 years, you're looking back 15 iterations of construction loans, and that just seems like massive overkill. So that's the way we've done that. There is some flexibility in the look back periods, and if you have more questions about that, we can talk with you individually about it.
Yeah, great. And then the next question has come in as if the calculation's been validated / audited and possibly mentioned in the SOC 1. So that's a fact. What they did is kind of went through our calculations. They also just look at our internal controls and processes for managing the data. So yes, that has been all done. We've done it each year. So we just recently had our SOC 1 updated. So that is available under the resources tab. Hi, good morning, Rick. Right now, we will put the policies out there. Originally, we had been doing it just on request, but I think we've had enough requests at this point. Is that
I think we're gonna look today.
Yeah, we will get those out under the CECLSolver resources for everybody to be able to access those. So those will show up here in the under those resources buttons next week. A couple more questions, Steve. We can get a copy of the policy templates. And then the next question from Molly was, how do you handle or put in unused commitments in mortgage loan programs that are off balance sheet, such as MPF or the FHLB?
Okay.
So I think there's actually 2 questions in there, Steve. So
yeah, I'll speak to the general unfunded commitments. And then you can speak to the other. So while I'm sharing the screen and looking at the tool, why don't we just go ahead and jump right over there? So CECL pertains not just to your loan portfolio, but also to loans, held to maturity securities and unfunded commitments. So anything that's got potential for credit risk, not interest rate risk, but real credit risk. So your unfunded commitments, the FDIC loves to keep everyone on their toes by asking for lots of information on your unfunded commitments on the call reports, but then not using the same buckets as they do for the loan portfolio. So, but we can get some information about your unused commitments from the call reports. And so our starting point is that. So we extract every quarter the detail on your unfunded commitments from the call reports. We work with you to net out any that are unconditionally cancelable. One bone that the FASB threw us from a CECL standpoint when it comes to unfunded commitments was that they said that any of these commitments that are unconditionally cancelable, like unused credit card lines, you can freeze that remaining credit at any point for any reason. You don't need to jump through a bunch of legal and regulatory hoops to do so. Anything that meets that definition can be netted out, and we don't have to worry about it from a CECL standpoint. HELOCs are a gray area. So that's something you want to talk to your accountants about, because sometimes the HELOCs can be defined as unconditionally cancelable. Sometimes they cannot. Once you're able to back that out, then whatever's left over, those are the unused commitments that you're really committed for at least a period of time to fund if the customers ask you to. Then we have to jump through a couple hoops, like what's the likelihood it gets funded? For how long do you have that legal binding commitment to extend the credit? And then what losses might we see if they were to get funded? So those are the steps that we walk you through in the unfunded commitment module here of the tool. It's all a little bit hypothetical, right? Because they're asking you to project long-term losses in the future on loans that don't even really exist yet. So it's but with all that being said, this is how you would go about doing it, and we provide some good detail. If you're question some of these columns here and where some of the default and guidance is coming from, look down in the footnotes. We have a good explanation of it here. And then also another one of those resources is just right here is our user guide. So this was we recently updated the user guide. And if I click on it, I'll open it for just a second. It's a really great visual step-by-step guide. If you haven't looked at this in a while and you're trying to remember just, what should I be thinking about as I'm running it on a quarterly basis? We got a new analyst at the bank. We want them to be familiar with it. This is your first kind of step to kind of getting a refresher of how the tool works, what to be thinking about. And if I scroll down towards the end, you'll see there's a nice long page explaining all the steps of the unfunded commitments and how to be handling that. So just another good tool and resource there. We try to keep it updated. We're always making updates to the tool. So this the user guide will continually get updated as well. John?
Great, Steve. We got another question. Does CECLSolver have a manual? Oh, let me back up. Regarding the MPF and the FHLB, right? So those are sold off balance sheet. Typically with MPF, you might have, if you're servicing these loans, you're audited by FHLB. So again, your credit risk with them is really only if there's probably an error. So I think those are probably less relevant to the CECL calculation unless you want to, put in a Q factor to essentially account for that portfolio. But again, I think just as the way the unfunded commitments are addressed here in CECL, that's really more relevant, as Steve was touching on, to extensions of credit that you've already approved but have not been yet drawn. There's a follow-up question. Is there a change in call reporting necessary for unconditionally cancelable commitments? Assuming we've been reporting all, but some are actually unconditionally cancelable. So Steve, I think that's, again, to your point, that why we have that column.
Oh, yeah. So I think that is, the concept of having a reserve for the unfunded commitments is not a new concept. There is a line item in the call reports currently for it in the other liabilities section, but the vast majority of community banks do not fill that out. We will all be filling it out come March 31st. And but for the unconditionally cancelable, that was defined in the CECL standard by FASB, what exactly how that is what constitutes unconditionally cancelable. Just keep in mind that there are multiple definitions of unconditionally cancelable. I think there's a more regulatory definition for like risk-based capital, and then there is a more accounting type definition. And my understanding is, well, FASB, as you would imagine, leans towards the more accounting definition. And so I think, and in the accounting definition, things like HELOCs are less likely to be able to be considered unconditionally cancel. I mean, what constitutes a significant enough condition is a good question I would say without a perfect answer yet. But we're going to get a lot of information over the next couple of quarters as people are actually starting to have these conversations in their audits and in their exams. And we'll get there's what the standard says that was written years ago, and then there's what's going to happen in practice in the real world. And as we know, those things rarely, if ever, perfectly track each other.
Yeah, and Celeste, it may be just something we want to have a conversation afterwards with. Again, I think this is, for most banks, it's not a terribly material number. I think it's also an area where there really hasn't been much prescription. So what we tried to do was, again, simply organize that information for our banks. A question that comes up a lot around those are, in fact, as Steve touched on, what is truly unconditionally cancelable? So I think it's an area where every bank probably has a different interpretation. As Steve mentioned, there's an accounting definition and a regulatory definition, but there's also a legal description of if your notes actually allow it. And so I think there's a lot of stuff to do. But I think the important piece at the transition is, for most banks, it's not going to be terribly material. So you want to address it, but I think it's something you'll get more comfort and clarity around how you want to handle those as we kind of move forward, and we'll keep talking about it. But happy to discuss that with you more specifically.
Yeah, it's one of those things we always say is that, we want to look at what is really significant and material before deciding how much time we need to spend on it, right? We don't want you wasting inefficiently spending a huge amount of time on something that ends up being a rounding error in the final calculation, right? So if you're pulling your hair out about whether a certain subsect of one bucket meets the definition of unconditionally cancelable, go look and see what your loss rate is on that segment to begin with. Because if let's say none of them were unconditionally cancelable, we got to do something for the whole bucket. But then though, if and when they become loans, it's a segment of loans you haven't had any losses on in 10 years. Well, it doesn't matter how big the commitment is if your loss expectation, were they to be funded, is still close to zero, right? So you kind of make sure you're thinking about that, so we just don't spend any unnecessary time.
Next question is, does CECLSolver have a manual input for economic loss rate adjustment calculation?
Yeah, so we've in the Q factor section, which we've added to a couple times as we've made some iterations of a tool here. What you'll recognize is that this is kind of your home base for all those qualitative factor adjustments, and you'll recognize a lot of these these columns are Q factor suggested qualitative factor adjustments that come directly from the interagency guidance that we've had for our ALLL for decades now. And one of those columns is economic conditions. So making adjustments based upon economic conditions. We also provide a bunch of economic time series down here so that you can sort of overlay that economic time series on top of your loss experience and your peers' loss experience. And when you see or believe that there's enough correlation there and direction to justify making an adjustment based upon those economic trends, you can do so. So what you can do here is say, if I want to look at PPI for corn, I can see how that got. I picked that because obviously there's been some significant movement there in the last couple of years, and I can compare that to commercial charge-offs over time for me and my peer group. I can also go upstream if I'm looking for more emerging credit trends, right? To see, well, before it ever becomes charged off, obviously it becomes non-accrual. So that trend might look a little bit different, or at least a little bit more upstream. And then I can go all the way upstream. First time any credit issue is going to show up on a call report where we can chart it for you is 30 to 89 days. So you can play around with some of these time series and compare them to different economic trends. And then this is where you'd plug in any sort of qualitative factor adjustment for economic conditions. Sean?
And that can also be found on the credit industry credit research tab on the homepage of QwickAnalytics as well. Even more integrated approach to that. Okay, so let me take back the screen, Steve.
Do you want to do that real quick or no?
Go back. You want to show the credit research tab real quick?
Yeah, I'm gonna hold the control button so we don't lose where we're at here. Open up a new tab. This is the home page when you first log in. This is your dashboard, and I can go right here to industry credit research. So when I click on that, this is just a neat little interactive tool here that allows you to take any sort of credit trend on any segment of your portfolio over any periods you want and compare it to other individual banks, compare it to peer groups, compare it, and then overlay any economic data that you want. So let's say we want to look at losses on mortgages, and I want to go with, I'll just go with net charge-offs, the easiest one, percentage of loans, and I'm going to add our sample bank here. You can type in your bank name and then research it. And there's Greg Dancing. And let's say we don't want 3 years. We want to take a long-term view here, right? So we're going to go with 12 years. So there's 12 years worth of net charge-off ratios for our mortgages. And I want to add another, let's say, add another bank. This is a bank here in my neck of the woods. And I can add a second bank next to it. And let's say I also want to compare all the community banks in the state of Alabama, or in any one MSA or something, but I'll go with the whole state of Alabama. What the heck? Now I have, Alabama had some losses back there. And then last but not least, I really want to look at look at the unemployment rate for Alabama and overlay that on top. I'm going to overlay that guy and I'll make it red just for the heck of it. So now we can see kind of in one chart what our loss trends have been, what a individual peers have been, what a large group of peers have been, and what an economic trend has been. And you can hover over it and see all the data points. But if you want all the data points, you can say, well, just show me the chart data. And this will give you all your numerators and denominators for every single data point in here, and then a definition of exactly how we calculate that ratio. And of course, you can export it to PDF, portrait or landscape with a single click, or export all of this, the chart and all the data directly into Excel. So this is a great little visual tool for looking at credit trends and comparing them with economic trends. John?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, just want a reminder because that is, we think, a really helpful tool.
Yeah.
And I think as Celeste just mentioned as well in the chat, she uses it for some of her Q factors. And I think that was really our idea, was, again, just to kind of give you some context around that and maybe see if there are, in fact, any correlations that might inform your Q factors.
I know I'm
in a
jumping out of
particular
turn.
way.
I know I'm jumping out of turn here, Sean, but let's say you did this and this was part of your justification for an economic Q factor adjustment. You'd say, I'd love to take this, make a file for it, and then upload it and attach it to my CECL analysis so that I have that as part of my notes, right? I'd come in here and make a PDF. There's my PDF. There it is. And I'm gonna just download it. I've downloaded it right there. And now I come back into my CECL tool. This is our newer, we now have this as a feature. It's called File Upload. It just allows you, the user, to upload any files you want that either pertain to, let's say you have a new policy statement and you want to just have your policy statement here attached to your CECL analysis. Not to one specific scenario, but just in general, right? So this is the general file bucket. You can upload, you can drag and drop files in here. PDFs, Word docs, Excel files, or probably most of them, right? And then if I want to add one to the scenario, let's say I pull up a scenario here, or I just saved a new scenario, and then I'm going to go ahead and upload a file, and I can click, and then I can find a file here, and click on it, and then open it and give it a name. I can give a test description, upload it. So not only is the file here and attached to just this scenario, but if I hover over it, I get any little text that I added. So let's say I had saved that that PDF of the economic data, I could say, Q factor narrative for economic adjustment, and save it and attach it, append it right to the scenario. John?
Yeah, and I think, again, that was our idea. We had a number of banks ask us about their own Q factor narrative or analysis that they wanted to make part of their reporting package. And so, yeah, Steve mentioned a couple of ways you can use it. Hopefully you'll find that a helpful way to include any ancillary material or any internal analysis that you want to make part of your reporting. Okay, Steve, I think this time I will try to take it back and jump back to the.
Sure. How do I stop sharing this?
I think I can just take it. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it wasn't giving me the.
All right. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Are you seeing my screen, Steve?
Yeah. You're good.
Okay. So here's just, again, an example of, of the file.
Yeah.
Of the file upload that Steve just touched on. And again, hopefully you'll find this helpful. If you have any questions on it, certainly let us know. The next topic we want to talk about is in our an enhanced warm estimator. So a couple of things to point out here. When we initially designed our tool, given the fact that in kind of simple construct, the longer warm period you have, almost by definition, the more conservative approach you're taking, because you're going to be aggregating potentially net charge-offs over a much longer period of time. Our initial idea was to take that slant, right? To be the most conservative as we possibly could. Now, in the midst of having, hundreds of banks using the solution, we did have a number of them say, hey, we just don't feel like that adequately represents or reflects the warm of a particular category, particularly more often than not 1 to 4 family. So as a result, in talking with some institutions and Steve doing some additional research, we added some options for the warm estimator. Your standard calculation still is resident here, but we've provided a couple of potential alternatives should you feel that that warm period is too long. So Steve, take it away.
Yeah. So again, the initial version or the standard version of the warm estimator still focuses on a prepayment adjusted warm. So your typical weighted average remaining maturity, and then adjusting for prepayments. And at what prepayment speed is a great question and a huge assumption, part of CECL, of course, just like everything else seems to be. But we had some good data that we presented for prepayment guidance. Now, the initial data that we used for to help with some prepayment guidance, because typically, really long multi-period historical segment level prepayment studies are not something that most people can snap their fingers and just have presented to us. We looked at the FHFA, which has a prepayment monitoring report for mortgage related loans. And so we gave that as part of our kind of first step guidance for prepayment assumptions to use for warm calculations, and also some other stuff from the Fed for non-mortgage related loans. The FDIC hasn't really presented or provided any additional guidance, nor has FASB, and you wouldn't expect FASB to, I guess. But interestingly enough, the NCUA did provide a lot more guidance on prepayment assumptions and some sort of industry standard warm calculations. And although I know you guys are not credit union, we are looking at, very similar loan segmentation. And so when they did a study of all the credit unions in the United States that were under $100 million in assets and looked at their loan level data, which they have access to, and did a big kind of prepayment study to get some default prepayment, annualized prepayment calculations for different loan segments, that was certainly closer to helpful than anything we had seen in the past. And that was just a couple months ago, or October, I think, the NCUA released the results of that study, and they updated on a quarterly basis. So we present that data here. We suggest that, if you don't have access to any really good prepayment data about your own portfolio, that you might look at the FHFA stuff and look at the NCUA stuff and take it into account. And so we decided, listen, with all that information, I think this is the time we can go ahead and offer kind of an enhanced, a little bit more granular version of our warm estimator that has support for these different prepayment assumptions and for assumptions about amortization on your portfolio. The more conservative approach is not to go in and look at amortization data for every loan in your portfolio. It's just to say, we're going to use the whole balance. It's going to be more conservative, meaning it'll result in a longer warm and a slightly higher reserve. But now we're offering some options that do take into account the amortization, and they will bring those warms down some. So it's certainly a more aggressive approach, and leading to, all things considered, a little lower reserve, but they're all still well founded and in the guidance and what the FDIC and the auditors are allowing to see. And so that's what we've done here. We still take all that loan level data if you have us calculating your warms, and then we just summarize it here, and we show you, depending on which method you want to use, you can kind of pick and choose which warm you think is most appropriate based upon how aggressive or conservative you want to be. On the next slide, Sean, I just want to show that for a second. This is a summary. This is the detail. So this is what you'll have for each individual segment, or if you're using our warm estimator, or you're having us do it, you'll have a spreadsheet that looks just like this. The top left there is what we had before, which is just a straight basic warm calculation, only taking into account prepayments if you want to. On the right is a loan level with amortization, loan level amortization support if you want it. On the bottom left is just, hey, we'll take into amortization, but we'll do it on kind of a portfolio level approach, as opposed to dealing with each loan on a one-off basis. So a couple different options to get you to where you think you need to be from a warm perspective. Whenever we're enhancing a tool like this, we realize, it comes off as looking like we're continuing to make it, you could say, more complex or more complicated or more detailed, but whenever we think about these enhancements, we want to make sure that if you're using it, if you like to continue using it the way you have been using it, you don't need to do anything differently. You're still okay. If you think that these changes make sense and you want to dig into a little bit more detail to try to get those worms down, now we're providing some more methodology and data for you to get there. But do not feel like you have to undertake some new significant thing for your worm calculations if you're satisfied with the way they've been and you've been doing it the initial way for a period of time. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And again, I think the important thing is we're just trying to give you options to make sure you can tailor this to what you, again, is most appropriate for your institution. There is no one size fits all. I think a lot of banks would prefer their culture is to remain the most conservative, so they're comfortable with a longer warm. But certainly, I think particularly in institutions maybe where you have a high concentration of 1 to 4 families, that longer warm may not be something that you think is emblematic of what your portfolio really acts like. So again, just trying to provide some options. So again, we've got a number of questions. We do have a question on a fiscal year. I'm gonna, Steve, I don't know if you want to take that. I'll email that one after the presentation. Just make sure we've got that right.
Yeah, my understanding is if you do have a non-12/31 fiscal year end, like March 31st, June or September, that that CECL calculation that, instead of January 1 being your date, it'll be that first day after that quarter end. So the first time you'd have to do quarterly statements that taken into account would be that next quarter, which would so the latest anyone could ever possibly implement CECL, I guess, would be in October of this year, based upon if you had a 9/30 fiscal year end and you had to get it all squared away before 12/31. That's my understanding of it, but they've messed with that multiple times. So
Yeah,
FASB has changed that. I see that they both, because they had it as of 12/31. They said fiscal years ending after 12/31, but then they shifted it to like December 1st or December 5th or some
15th,
weird date
yeah.
to capture 15th. And so we want to be 100% sure that they haven't moved the goalpost on that again, but that is my understanding.
Yeah, and we will, I think what we'll end up doing is with the email that we send out, I think we'll go ahead and attach the policy templates, since we've had a number of requests for that throughout the presentation.
Yeah.
We will also get it up on the resources tab, but I think for everybody who attended today, we will make sure, or registered, we'll make sure we get that those policies attached to the email that we'll send up with the copy of the recording and the slides. As I mentioned, right, there'll be a number of topics that we'll continue to delve into. We will invite Paul Allen from Saltmarsh back to talk probably in the hopefully February, March session. So we are going to continue to bring our public accounting experts into our conversations. Again, I think for most of you, we're probably at that point where we're just simply doing that initial comparison. So, as you're working through it, if you have any questions or anything, just, certainly reach out to us. I don't see any additional questions. Steve, any final topics or thoughts before we let everybody get back to their day?
Not at this time, but again, you can always reach out to us if you want to, if you have any additional questions, if you need, someone to, if you want us, a kind of a sanity check on the work you've been doing in your scenarios and whatnot, please reach out to the sales team, and Sean and I will come in when necessary to help out. But we know this is a critical time for everyone, because while everything was theoretical up until a month ago, it's no longer theoretical for most of us anymore. And so everyone looks at things a little bit differently and has different questions once you actually have to jump in. So we're there with you every step of the way.
Yeah, thank you. And just another couple of comments. The file upload button is new. You can upload really anything you want to there, right? Anything you think is additive to your presentation or reporting of CECL. Again, we were thinking of it when we designed it was perhaps narratives or analysis that you might be doing on your Q factors, but it is really there to accentuate or add to anything, from our reporting that you feel is helpful to share with
It could be a
with third
DCF, and
parties.
it could be a DCF analysis on an impaired loan that you've individually assessed for a scenario, and you want to just attach that documentation right here so that when you open up in the, maybe a year from now, you can pull up the scenario that's a year old and see all the documents that went along with that scenario for whatever purposes. So it's an administrative feature. It helps in the audit trail, and it helps in the exam process, and it's just a way to organize the data within the tool.
Yeah, and then also just a reminder, again, I think anecdotally, for a lot of you, you may find that your CECL calculation isn't fairly different from or materially different from your ALLL. That is not an uncommon occurrence. I would say that's probably more the norm. So, I know that's been a question I've talked to a number of banks about this week. So again, just as you're going through that, if you have any questions, certainly reach out to us. We hope to kind of share, information as we move forward. And again, hopefully make this transition as seamless as we possibly can make it for you. So
just don't ask us to define the word material, please.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you for your continued support of these coffee talks. We will keep them coming. Let's see, one last question. Thank you, Barry. Appreciate the kind words. Thank you for your attendance today. Have a great weekend. And we will talk to you next month. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.